Good afternoon, students. Welcome to Srimeda IAS Academy. My name is Gowtham. I am a faculty for Political Science and International Relations. I also take classes for General Studies Paper 2 for segments related to Indian polity, governance, as well as international relations, that is, India-centered foreign affairs. Today, we are going to discuss a very important topic related to the Russia-Ukraine conflict. The topic is specifically presented to you today to make you understand or to impress upon you the idea that students who are preparing for civil services required to adopt a very diverse perspective on international events or issues. For example, when we discuss Russia-Ukraine relationship, we should understand not only the causes for the genesis of conflict, the course of conflict, the status of conflict, or how the conflict affected the international system, or what efforts were made by the international community to bring the conflict to an end. Apart from all this, students will also have to understand the conflict from a diverse perspective. That is, what kind of impact this conflict had. How did it impact the countries which were actually engaged in the conflict? How did the conflict impact the major powers? How did the conflict impact developing countries or emerging economies? And how did the conflict impact the international system as a whole? It is from such diverse perspectives that you should understand a conflict. Now, you know that the Russia-Ukraine conflict had impacted different groups of nations in different ways. For example, West Europe was impacted in a different way. The most dominant power, America, was impacted in a different way. China was impacted in a different way. The emerging economies like India, Indonesia, Brazil, they were impacted in a different way. You know, there are different angles to a conflict. It is this diverse perspective that students should adopt whenever they prepare for international relations, whether it is for political science and international relations or whether it is for general studies paper 2 as well. Now, today we'll try and understand the impact of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on the Western countries. As I told you, each region and each country was impacted differently by this conflict. For example, emerging economies like India, Brazil, United Arab Emirates, Indonesia, they had certain positives to take out from this conflict. Though, of course, it's a great humanitarian tragedy and it accounted for disproportionate costs, both in terms of material as well as resources. There were some trends which were unleashed by this conflict, which had little benefits to offer for the emerging economies. China was a big gainer from this conflict. China accessed not only Russian cheap oil, but also China could redesign its manufacturing sector to enter into high-tech precision goods and equipment to meet the needs of Russia. The Russian market, which was earlier occupied by West Europe, now could be accessed by China because of the trade embargo imposed by the West Europe on Russia. So China stood as a major gainer from this conflict. West Europe, on the other hand, was a major loser from this conflict. Why? Because the sanctions that were imposed on Russia by West Europe actually backfired on these countries. US also had to face the brunt of this conflict because the conflict resulted in significant erosion of US structural power as well as dollar domination. So different regions and different countries were affected differently by this conflict. Now, this is what is called as diverse perspective. In today's video, we'll try and understand how this conflict had impacted the West. What was the nature of the Western response to this conflict and how the Western countries were impacted by this conflict. This is the perspective from which we'll try to understand the nature of this conflict. Now, you know that the Russia-Ukraine war was primarily an outcome of the mistrust and the animosity that was generated because of the eastward expansion of NATO. NATO tried to integrate not only the East European countries, but also the former republics of Soviet Union. Now, this was not taken very easily or very gently by Soviet Union. Soviet Union considered this as a transgression or an encroachment on its sphere of influence, traditional sphere of influence, as well as a serious concern for its security implications. And therefore, Russia decided to take the issue seriously and use force and try and prevent the eastward expansion of NATO. So this was the genesis for the conflict. But the point that a good number of strategic experts start to raise in recent times is that Russia was clearly aware of what could be the repercussions of its invasion of Ukraine. Russia knew what to expect. Russia probably had anticipated the clamping of sanctions and using trade embargo and instruments like isolation of Russia. So Russia knew what to expect before this conflict. Russia also had very clearly calculated the repercussions. What could be repercussions on Russia? However, there was one trump card with Russia, and that is nuclear deterrence. Armed with the largest nuclear arsenal, Russia had an effective deterrent in case NATO or other Western countries used military option against Russia. Now, this was the trump card that was always available with Russia. And that's the reason why, right from the early days of the conflict, Russia continuously began to propagate the idea of a possible nuclear showdown in case the Western countries militarily intervened, or if the Western countries had their boots on ground for protection of Ukraine. Now, this was what was termed as open nuclear signaling and blackmail by Russia. However, Russia was clearly aware that the West is fearful of Russian nuclear capabilities. Now, this was one clear understanding of Russia. So, though Russia had clearly calculated the repercussions, Russia was ready. Russia was ready with a trump card. And thirdly, though Russia's expectations of a swift victory were belied, and the conflict that Russia had with Ukraine was prolonged, it was protracted, Russia showed immaculate ability to resist and withstand the pressure of the conflict for a very long time. Now, in spite of the fact that the conflict dragged on for years together, Russia showed remarkable ability to both absorb as well as advance. Now, this was how Russia could sustain its campaign against Ukraine. So, Russia was having a prior understanding of what could be the potential repercussions. Russia had a trump card. Russia also was clearly aware of its ability to withstand a prolonged or a protracted campaign. West, on the other hand, did not have this anticipation or foresight. The kind of reaction that West had shown towards the conflict is sometimes described by strategic experts as knee-jerk reaction. The reaction was almost spontaneous. The reaction was almost what we could say unplanned. It was a reaction which was based on very high moral ground rather than on strategic considerations or calculations. The Western countries assumed very high moral ground when they began to argue that Russia had violated international law. Russian actions are violative of all norms and traditions of international behavior of nation states. And West was more than enthusiastic to criticize Russia on several platforms and accuse Russia, try to show Russia in a complete bad light without giving any regard to Russian security concerns. Now, Russia had very clearly mentioned through several years before this invasion that eastward expansion of NATO and continuous efforts of the European countries to absorb the former republics within the NATO fold would not be taken easily by Russia, would not be taken gently by Russia. Russia had clearly indicated its security concerns. In fact, in 2021, that is 1 year before the launch of campaign in Ukraine, Russia had clearly issued an ultimatum to the European powers not to integrate Ukraine within the mechanism of NATO. So the kind of reaction that the Western countries had showed in the course of this conflict is, as I told you, considered as a knee-jerk reaction. It was a response that was based on moral high ground rather than on strategic considerations. A response that the Western countries had shown in the beginning of this conflict was almost predictable. As Russia had predicted, the West would be using sanctions as a tool of economic coercion to isolate Russia and to strike at Russia's economic interests and capitalize on the Russian economic instability to force Russia into stopping the campaign. Now, this was very highly predictable line of action which the West had adopted. And West, as I told you, reacted instinctively by imposing one of the most comprehensive set of sanctions on Russia ever known in human history. So, in modern times, such high incidence of sanctions were not imposed on any other country. So Russia was facing now with formidable and comprehensive set of economic sanctions imposed by West, including trade embargoes, denial of visas, then denial of technology, then exclusion from international financial arrangements like the SWIFT system, stoppage of oil trade, technology bans. Now all these were a part of the economic sanctions imposed on Russia. As I told you, comprehensive set of sanctions were imposed on Russia to compel Russia to stop its campaign on Ukraine. Also, the Western countries had used international platforms to isolate Russia, to diplomatically target Russia, bring about economic crisis in Russia, so that the economic crisis in Russia would propel a political movement and, if possible, even to bring about a regime change. Now, this was what was Western design against Russia. So, imposition of formidable set of sanctions to impact Russia in the form of an economic crisis, to make Russia economically unstable, and in that process, in that chaos, even if required or even if possible, bring about a regime change in Russia. Isolation of Russia in international multilateral fora and engaging in a diplomatic crusade against Russia, accusing it and making allegations against Russia of large-scale human rights violations and genocide and all this. Now, this was the Western reaction. The reaction was almost instinctive. The reaction was almost as predicted by Russia. Now, whether this strategy that was adopted by Western countries, including of course both West Europe as well as US, was this right? Was this the right way to tackle Russia? The Western countries further gave liberal aid to Ukraine, including both military as well as humanitarian, to help Ukraine sustain the Russian invasion and offer resistance. Ukraine had in fact stopped Russia, and even Russia had to face a lot of reversals, and even several Russian territories also were occupied by Ukrainian forces like the Kursk territory and so forth. Egged by the Western powers, Ukraine continued its campaign against Russia. In spite of the fact that Ukraine was facing a lot of loss, both in terms of manpower as well as resources, and Ukraine was getting more and more steeped in debt, which was offered liberally by the Western powers because they had to stop Russia. The war seemed to be having no solution, no end. Still, the European powers as well as America continued to finance an unwinnable war of Ukraine against Russia. It's today estimated that Ukraine is steeped in public debt to an extent of nearly $330 billion. And that is staggering, which is going to be a burden for Ukraine tomorrow. Even if all its campaign objectives are realized, it would still be a burden to contend with for Ukraine. This is the state to which Ukraine was pushed to by the Western countries. Strategically, probably the West did not see the right way to tackle the conflict situation in this East European region. Secondly, almost all the assumptions made by the European powers had gone wrong. The first assumption that the Western countries had in the course of this conflict was that the West countries assumed NATO's resilience and NATO's ability to quell or to impose a retreat on Russian forces. Now, whether you can really leverage the military alliance called NATO and its collective action to stop an aggression by another country is now put to question. So, NATO cannot be leveraged. It has come to everybody's understanding today that a military alliance called NATO cannot be used, cannot be leveraged to stop an aggression of another country. Secondly, this conflict also brought to the forefront the fractures and divisions within NATO. Donald Trump, the American president, had clearly mentioned his displeasure at the way the Western countries, the West European countries, were taking advantage out of NATO and shifting the onus or the responsibility of their role onto the shoulders of US. Donald Trump had clearly mentioned that Europe will have to start taking responsibility for its own defense and stop its over-dependence on US through NATO. So the fractures and the gulf between West Europe and US came to the forefront. So the assumption of the European countries on the resilience and on the singular approach of NATO has now been completely shattered. That's the first assumption that had gone wrong. Secondly, the Western countries assumed that Russia had no alternatives. Now, this is probably one of the most absurd assumptions made by the Western countries. Western countries assumed that facing with formidable sanctions, Russia would buckle down. Russia would have to go back on its campaign. Russia would not be able to sustain because Russia had no alternatives. But the truth was, the imposition of these sanctions actually opened up alternatives for Russia. Russia began to engage itself more closely with its former allies and started also to begin new alliances. So, the assumption of the Western countries that Russia is not left with much alternative was actually proved seriously flawed. Third assumption, the Western countries assumed on the effectiveness of economic warfare. The Western countries believed that the trade embargoes, exclusion of Russia from international financial arrangements, Western countries believe that technology denial to Russia were very effective instruments, geostrategic weapons through which Russia can be brought to its knees. That also proved to be wrong. That assumption also had gone wrong because sanctions did not affect Russia as much as the Western countries assumed. The Russian economy, though initially showed weaknesses and showed deceleration, bounded back again. And the kind of growth that was achieved by Russian economy actually embarrassed the Western countries. That was another assumption that had gone wrong. The fourth assumption was that Russia would catapult. Protracted and prolonged struggle would make Russia come to its senses and it would result in Russia capitulating. But that also did not come true. Russia had, as I told you, showed remarkable ability to continue with its campaign, notwithstanding the reversals it was facing. This also was not to the anticipation of the European powers. Fifthly, they also underestimated Russian capacity to withstand. Though Russia was isolated, though Russia was subjected to sanctions, though the campaign continued for a very long time, and though Russia was completely isolated from the international financial arrangements for years together, Russia could withstand. All the assumptions of the Western countries did not come or did not become the truth. In fact, it was America which, for the first time, made certain observations about the effectiveness of sanctions in bringing a country to acceptance. In 2025, February, the Secretary of State in America declared that a tool which is used not less than 19 times without realizing its objective would not be a strategy anymore. It should be considered as a failure. Economic sanctions, which were imposed 19 times on Russia, did not yield results. It means the strategy requires to be reviewed. It means the strategy requires to be subjected to proper autopsy, scrutiny, and whether the strategy that we have adopted is the right strategy to deal with the situation or not. Western countries were simply continuing with the policy of imposing sanctions, sometimes more sanctions, sometimes less sanctions. 19 times sanctions were renewed, they were imposed again and again without any effect. This shows that the assumption of economic weapon called sanctions had actually proved wrong in this conflict. So many assumptions of the Western countries proved to be wrong. In fact, it is also observed by a good number of experts that these sanctions had in fact backfired on the European powers. The sanctions which were intended to cripple Russia, hurt Russia, have actually backfired. They have backfired because these sanctions began to affect West Europe in a much more adverse way than they were supposed to affect Russia. So how did these sanctions backfire on Europe? Firstly, the imposition of sanctions had reshaped global power itself. The sanctions have actually weakened Europe and increased alternatives for Russia. How did it weaken Europe? Russia, in an economic suicidal way, had deprived itself of cheap Russian natural gas and had to depend now on American supply at double the prices. This in fact had led to deindustrialization of Europe. Industries related to chemicals, heavy machinery, automobiles began to suffer because of these sanctions imposed on Russia by Europe. In fact, one of the key sector in European economy, the iron and steel, also began to suffer because of the shortage of energy supply. So actually, the Western powers were sanctioning themselves rather than sanctioning Russia. Now, that was the problem with these sanctions. So these sanctions reshaped global power because it weakened Europe. It weakened the European claim on the effectiveness of economic sanctions as a geostrategic weapon. And secondly, these sanctions that were used led to industries from Europe being located in other countries like Asia or even in America. So this led to what's called as deindustrialization. This was a very unexpected impact of the sanctions imposed by the Western countries. Secondly, these sanctions also have made Russia realize a greater number of alternatives, and in fact, therefore, Russia got itself more strengthened because it could now diversify its trade relations. Previously, Russian trade was oriented more towards West, but now Russian trade, particularly oil trade, is now more oriented towards its east and its south. So Russia began to build new trade relations with countries like UAE, Turkey, India, Indonesia, Brazil, began to strengthen its already robust trade relationship with China and Far East countries. Now, this was another unexpected impact of the sanctions. Therefore, the sanctions, instead of weakening Russia and crippling Russia, had in fact strengthened Russia. That's one another unexpected or unintended consequence of the sanctions imposed by the West on Russia. Thirdly, The imposition of sanctions by Europe had permanently redrawn the energy map in Eurasia. Till this conflict, Europe accounted for the highest amount of Russian export. Europe cumulatively was the largest importer of Russia's oil and natural gas. But since this conflict had begun, the entire energy map of Europe and Asia began to be redrawn. So Russia was presiding on a new energy grid that was centered around Asia Pacific region. Now this is another unintended consequence of the sanctions imposed on Russia. It actually had strengthened Russia. And Europe, on the other hand, was voluntarily surrendering its energy security on a permanent basis. Why? Because we had already seen the beginnings of the development of huge pipelines from the Siberian region to Asia Pacific. Now, this is going to permanently alter the energy grid. Now, this is how the West became more and more vulnerable because of the altered nature of energy map in Eurasian region. Russia and Russian capability to survive under pressure is an example for every other country which previously nurtured some doubts or some inhibitions or fears about the sanctions. Russia showed to the world the ineffectiveness of sanctions. Of course, Russia was building on its huge oil and natural gas reserves. Yet, Russia could overcome the isolation. Russia could overcome the exclusion of international financial arrangements. Russia could overcome the deprival of dollars for conduct of its trade. Russia showed to the world the way that Western financial hegemony can now be countered effectively. Now, this is another staggering impact of sanctions which are imposed on Russia. This is sometimes also called as a structural shift of power. So how did this conflict affect a structural shift of power at a global scale? Now please remember that this conflict, the West expected, would lead to Russian isolation. But that was not to be the truth. As I told you, Russia found alternatives. Russian isolation actually had propelled BRICS, an international grouping consisting of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to develop alternative systems. BRICS had actually expanded in 2024 to include new countries like Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, UAE. It became BRICS Plus. Again, in 2025, Indonesia was added to BRICS. A lot of other countries also showed keenness to join with BRICS. So slowly, BRICS began to emerge as a very serious contender with a lot of attraction for the other developing economies as well as developing large economies, the emerging economies, who were wanting to be members of BRICS. It shows that countries are now slowly beginning to become contemptuous to the Western domination of the international financial system. The popularity of BRICS itself is an indication that countries had actually resented the Western hegemony and Western domination of the international financial system. Also, we discussed about institutionalization of non-Western financial infrastructure in the form of New Development Bank and contingency reserve arrangement. All these, which were actually formed earlier itself, began to gather momentum. They began to gather more adherents and supporters to this viewpoint. That's how there was a structural shift of power. USA is being challenged. West Europe is being challenged. This is something which is going to have a profound effect for the future.